How's it going, guys? Akira here, and today we'll be talking about the 25th anniversary or the 25th birthday of the PlayStation 2. So yeah, it's wow, it's hard to believe that the PS2 is 25 years old. Um Obviously, the most successful console of all time, the best-selling console of all time at 160 million. And it's a lot of people's favorite console of all time. It's probably one of the most, if not the most beloved console of all time. And yeah, it's crazy how it's been 25 years since, it's been released. Now, today, March 4th, 2025, it's Japanese release date anniversary, but I know in America this came out, and I believe it was in October 26th of the same year, 2000. So, like uh towards the end of the year. But regardless, happy 25th birthday to the PlayStation 2. And yeah, it's pretty crazy how, one day after the Switch's birthday is the PS2's birthday, two goats. if you want to say it like that. But yeah, what else can be said about this console? The PS2 came out at a time where you know, it was, the trend of the millennia, right? A lot of consoles, you know, from the fifth generation that they were just learning, and we were just brand new to the 3D graphics stuff. They were perfecting 3D gameplay and 3D visuals and all that stuff. And we saw with the Dreamcast how impressive that was. And then we were to see it on the PS2 and the GameCube and the OG Xbox. But yeah, one impressive thing about the PS2, right, is that it's very unique. Unlike other consoles, right? This console was a success worldwide. For example, right? Let's say something like the NES, right? The NES was big in Japan, big in America, but it was kind of okay in like Europe and like South America. So you would say, it was only, a big hit in two regions, and meanwhile the other regions it was like a moderate-ish success, right? The Nintendo 64, huge hit here in America, right? Everybody and their mom is nostalgic about the Nintendo 64, and oh my god, I used to play like GoldenEye and etc. But guess what? In Japan, the Nintendo 64 was a huge flop. Like, it came in third place. The Sega Saturn and the PS1 outsold the N64. I believe the N64 only sold around 8 million in Japan, 6 million, something like that, which is crazy to think because here, in America, the 64, everybody talks about it. But yeah, in Japan, 64 was a flop. But then, you look at the other way, right? The Sega Saturn was a flop here in America, but and in other regions, but it was a huge success in Japan, right? So and then the Sega Genesis was huge in Europe. Sega Genesis was huge here in America, but in Japan, it's the Sega Genesis, or the Mega Drive, known in there, horrible flop as well, just like the N64. So each console has their successful in one region, they're unsuccessful in the other one. Right here, as you see here in my hoodie, the Xbox 360 was always big in America, but the Xbox 360 or any Xbox never took off in Japan. Sort of like that. But the PS2, it was its own beast, man. It was successful literally everywhere. South America, the Oceania regions, Australia, Southeast Asia, right? Europe, Western Europe, the UK, even Eastern Europe, in Poland and places like that didn't have video games before, besides Famiclones and just like cheap Chinese knockoffs of like, Famicons or whatever. This is its first legitimate, console that was huge and successful over there. Obviously, America and Japan, right? Um, the PS2 was just that console that was just worldwide success, and everybody had it, right? Obviously, part of it was, you know, the PS1 was a huge hit, so everybody was waiting for the sequel, right? Part two. How big was it gonna be? On top of that, also DVDs were coming into popularity, and the PS2 was the cheapest DVD player around, so some people bought it for that, and then they're like Let's buy, this two-in-one, device, right? It's a video game console and a DVD player. And, just this huge library, right? I believe from what I've seen um, in a few places here, it is estimated that it's around 5,000 games released worldwide on the PS2, like over 5,000. I've heard somewhere else that it was 8,000. I'm not sure, but I've seen the number 5,000 thrown out there, more. But regardless, right? It's probably the biggest library of all time. I guess besides like Steam and like and I guess now PS4 and Switch are like up there as well. But if it's not the biggest gaming library, it's probably one of like the top three uh biggest gaming library that this console had, because everybody wanted to publish a game for the PS2. If you were a game developer or a game publisher, you wanted a game on this console, right? And yeah, and then on top of that, Sony did an amazing job with backwards compatibility, right? You got to remember, a lot of video game companies, that when they were coming in and making their consoles throughout the 70s, the 80s, and 90s, most of them failed. And that's why, a lot of people don't know, of super obscure consoles, right? Like the Atari, after the 2600, like the 5200, the 7800, the Jaguar, they all fell into obscurity because they weren't successful, right? They did plenty of mistakes, and on top of that, Nintendo and Sega taking a stronghold, right? Companies like Apple, a lot of people don't know this, but Apple made a console, right? The Apple Pippin in the 90s, but it was such a flop that it fell into obscurity, right? So it's like, wow, Apple made a game console. Yep, they did. Stuff like the Panasonic 3DO, a console came out, right? They tried to do some revolutionary stuff, but it was too expensive, $700. You have stuff like the Tom's Marty, the Fairchannel F. You have stuff like the TurboGrafx 16. Even though it was a good, it was a success in Japan, known as the PC Engine. Here in America, people were like, "What the heck is a TurboGrafx 16?" Stuff like that. You can go way back, right? 70s, 80s, 90s, right? But when PlayStation, right, when Sony, they were gonna make their consoles, people at that time, they were like, wow, oh, it's probably another one that's gonna want to throw their hat in the ring and they're gonna fail and back out. But it was the first console to ever hit 100 million, and the first time when a company hits a huge success on their first try. So obviously, people want to see what's the sequel to that. So then, obviously you have that going in the PS2. So everybody that has a PS1 and they bought a PS1 and all the peripherals and memory cards and controllers, they were like, wow, this is a smart investment to go for a PS2, because all my stuff that I have on PS1, the games, the memory cards, the accessories, the controllers, they would work perfectly on a PS2. So you had those people going in. You had people, casual people, right, that they were learning to the PS2, through the DVD playback, and they're like, you know what? I guess I might as well get a game for this, So then you got those people coming in. Oh, excuse me, I bumped into the camera. Yeah, and just stuff like that, gamers that were coming in, that were getting older, and they're like, oh, Nintendo's too kiddie or whatever, and they wanted something more mature. They bought into the PS2. So everybody from every region, had, a reason to get a PS2, and, this console just appealed to everyone, right? Another thing, I believe it is one of the longest. I don't know if it's like the longest or the second longest, because I know in Sega, in Brazil, the Sega Master System still going on. But let's just say, right, top two longest running, longest supported console of all time. The final game for the PS2 was Pro Evolution Soccer 2014, which is crazy to think about. 14 years later, the console came out in 2000, and then in 2014 we had a game, and by that time, think about it. Not only was the PS3 already out, but the PS3 was on its way out, and the PS4 was already in the market. So the PS4, the Wii U, the Xbox One, people were playing on their Vitas and 3DS. It's crazy. During that era, right? The final PS2 game had come out, which is crazy. And then yeah, and then I know Sony, they always have to do their slims variants, because and they like to like redesign their consoles. And they came out with a slim in 2004, and it's pretty cool. Unlike the fat version, instead of having a disc tray that comes out, it's just like a top loader, which I honestly I do prefer, to be honest. But regardless, huge success, right? Another thing that the PS2 did great, it was also that it globalized a lot of public game publishers or game developers, where back then, right, it was more common for games to come out in one region but then not in another one. I believe, from what I remember, that thing started becoming more common in the PS2 era. But still, there were still games that would come out on, like, let's say, Japan and Europe, but not in America, or in Japan, but not in America or Europe, or et cetera, et cetera. I know that Sega, right? Sega, once the Sega Dreamcast had they discontinued it. Sega poured a lot of their classic games and a lot of their multiplats on PS2, obviously, GameCube and Xbox. So we had that going on. Sega started publishing on other stuff. So it was another publisher for to add on to the PS2. And yeah, it was just a good time to game. I was too young at the time, so I never had one when I was little. But talking to people who experienced this in their childhood or their teenagehood, or it was their console when they would go to college in their dorms, and it was just everyone had that. It was kind of like the DS or the Wii, where everybody had it. And yeah, it's crazy to think about that. 25 years later, this console is still going on, right? Among retro game collectors, is probably still the console that people buy the most, or one of the ones that they buy the most in the games, because I know old school Nintendo stuff is like really popular. But the PS2 is always there, man. You go around at any retro game store or even GameStop now, in the retro sections, they're always gonna be a PS2 game. They're always gonna be a PS2 game, whether it's a top tier game like San Andreas or Gran Turismo or Metal Gear Solid 3, or if it's just like a sports game like a Madden or a FIFA, or a wrestling game. There's always a PS2 game everywhere you go, anything video game related. And it's one of the most beloved consoles of all time, deservingly so. Even in 2025, 25 years later, I still think it's still, if you want to collect for a console, I think this is probably one of the first choice I would suggest, because the library is so huge and games are still very cheap. Obviously, you have your games that are expensive, right? Like Rule of Rose is is like $600, $800, something like that. I know with Kuon is another one, and Haunting Grounds, those are like $500+ games. But those are like the exception, not the rule. Most of your games are gonna run you very cheap, and your top tier games, your San Andreas, your Gran Turismos, your Dragon Ball Z Budokais, you name it, Metal Gear Solid, everything else. But yeah, I generally think that if you've never played a PS2, right, and you've been interested in collecting for retro stuff, I think you should go and get one out, right? The consoles itself are very cheap. The memory cards, the controllers, you get up to a CRT, and it just gives you that old school 2000s nostalgia. I remember for the longest time, this was my favorite console of all time. It's no longer my favorite console of all time, but it's definitely still like within like the top 3, top 5 range. But regardless, it's just an amazing console. No matter what type of gamer you are, there are games for everybody, right? Not only are they like the the mature edgy games like Tony Hawk and GTA and Metal Gear Solid that that everybody in the 2000s was trying to be, but you have more fun stuff, more cartoony mascots like Sly Cooper, Ratchet and Clank. You have super cool stuff like Super Monkey Ball, and Parappa the Rapper, and Ape Escape and stuff like that. So I think there definitely is something for everyone with this console. And yeah, happy 25th anniversary, happy 25th birthday to the PlayStation 2. I generally think this is the greatest console of all time. I think yeah, I think it just did almost everything right. Obviously, there's no such thing as a perfect console. Every console has their flaws, but man, it's really hard finding something to really complain about that's not a nitpick, you know, about the PS2. At least, you know, in my opinion, right? But yeah, other than that, you know, what do you guys think? You guys like your PS2? Do you guys have played a PS2? If you haven't, you want to go look out for one. Happy 25th anniversary. It's a quarter of a century old, which is crazy to think about. And yeah, um, happy 25. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. And if you guys like my content, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. I would like to hear, you know, what are you guys' thoughts on the PS2. But yeah, please consider subscribing, and peace out, guys.